Hello and welcome to this edition of Let's Talk Forensic Psychology Today. We're doing a special edition today as September is Suicide Prevention Month, and so we wanted to discuss what we know is quite an emotive subject. As staff work in insecure environments, sadly we've been affected by this subject, and as well as we may well have known people in our personal lives who've made the decision to take their own lives. So in today's session, we'd like to introduce our colleague, Gemma Grahame-Wright, who's an officer who has a psychology degree and now applies that in her job as an officer. And she's worked in prison for over 20 years. So Gemma, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I think you've said it all there, Jerry, but thank you. My name's Gemma. I've been in the prison service now for 23 years, worked 17 years at Bullingdon, and now I've been at Grendon for 6 years. And I work as an officer facilitator.
Okay, thanks for that, Gemma. So we're interested to hear your experience of this. And I suppose generally we were thinking how the act of taking someone's own life was originally called self-murder, and it became a crime under common law in England in the mid-13th century, so a long time ago, and it was actually illegal until 1961. So people who attempted to take their own lives could then, if they failed, be charged and convicted of it afterwards. So it's quite hard to imagine that in this day and age.
It feels like a really difficult concept to get my head around. Someone would be like, it's illegal to take your own life. I find that really odd. Yeah,
it does seem a really strange thing. And we often think about, as we do on this channel, about the use of language. And so generally people refer to it as committing suicide, which people, now say, well, that's not right, because people haven't committed it as if they've committed a serious offence. They've actually made a decision to take their own life. So they might have died by suicide or taken their own life rather than committed suicide. But I think we often find we use these terms because they've been used over many years, and so people do still use those terms without meaning to cause offence to people.
And I think it's interesting though, sort of thinking about that regarding sort of we're talking there about committing an offence by taking your own life, and how that would be looked down on. But I think it's a case for people that are left behind. Initially, there will be the sadness, but also people experience the anger at someone that has done that. So when they're actually committing something, I would say that the majority of people that I have known who have taken their own lives have intended to do it. I think you've got a lot of people in prison that you'll meet who make the attempt but don't actually mean to sort of like actually to kill themselves. But then you've got a lot of people that will not go for the self-harm route. I think a lot of people would think, okay, then so they're self-harming, that means it's going to lead to suicide. Not necessarily the case. So you're going to have quite a few people, I would imagine, over the years who have taken their own lives but have chosen, staff have not been aware of beforehand. I can only think of 2 occasions where I've been there at the time where someone has been found to have taken their own lives. And I think as people in uniform, you kind of like, you literally just go into, what do I need to do? What do I need to sort out? And how quickly can I do so? I think it's only afterwards for the person that maybe that has, walked in to find someone that's taken their own lives, it's only afterwards that things might kick in for them. At the time, I tell you one thing that's amazing is other prisoners, other residents, they will be actually quite, I want to say, helpful. And working at Bullingdon, local prison, getting people behind their doors was hell most of the time. But actually times like that, they seem to respect it a little bit and actually go behind their doors pretty quickly.
I remember when somebody on the assessment wing at Grendon took his own life, and it was around Christmas time, and we were talking to the other residents, and it was surprising, or maybe it shouldn't be, but it was surprising about how many of them had already been affected by having been in that position, either by family members or friends outside or by people in prison. And lots of them had witnessed people taking their own lives in prison or the aftermath of it. And I think it's something people don't really think about as a trauma that people in prison experience, having seen that, and sometimes on a quite regular basis, and how traumatic that is for people.
I think because we are never going to know exactly why someone took their own life. Yeah, someone might leave a note, someone might give us sort of like some indication, we might be kind of thinking, oh, if it was like, if we were talking about prisoners, oh, he was looking at a 20 stretch, he was looking at a 30 stretch, it's not surprising. But actually we don't know. It would be lovely to hear from people after they sadly passed away, to find out what was it that actually took them to that point where they chose to take their own lives. However, it's, you know, it's information we can only guess at. And I think for some people in prison, especially people that maybe, you know, English isn't their first language, communication, family, etc., we don't know what's going on for them. We don't know whether it's about, you know, someone might have chosen to take their own life because of their offence, they've fallen out with family members, they aren't, you know, it is a call for help, but it's gone wrong. As I say, I haven't found that very common with people that have actually, you know, taken their own lives. But yeah, I think it's really difficult, and I think it's one of those subjects that can be debated for a long time. And I think that I'd imagine as well there's got to be a lot of people mindset, as in, I wouldn't want to do that to my friends, I wouldn't want to do that to my family. However, if they're in a situation, if they're in a way of thinking, and that's the only way they can see out, all of that's forgotten.
I was always struck when I first started working prison, residents would talk about how dying in prison was like the last resort, like people don't want to die in prison. And even if we experienced on the wing before a man who had a heart attack, and it was so important that the residents knew that he died outside of the prison gates rather than in prison. This idea, you just don't want to die in prison. So then when someone in prison does take their own life, it makes me think about what kind of point they must be in their mind, or what they're experiencing to take their own life in prison. If we're thinking about that same logic, you know.
And I think quite often it'll be people that you wouldn't expect.
Yeah.
Because it's not the people that are on the act to check to make sure that he's okay. So if at any point anybody is concerned regarding a prisoner, you know, the way he is behaving, if things that he said, anniversaries of maybe an offence or a death or anything like that.
So that's a risk of suicide or self-harm. So if somebody's at risk of self-harm either, to help support them through that. Yeah, so it's interesting. Obviously, the most recent statistics are during COVID, so it's hard to know. And I think people expected, with the levels of distress there were in the community and in custody, that there would be higher figures, but actually there hasn't been. In fact, there's been a decrease of people taking their own lives in prison, which has been, I think, most people found surprising. Lots of the figures come out have been during the first 2 lockdowns, so obviously we haven't got the more recent figures because it takes time for them all to be analysed, but yeah, it's interesting that there haven't been increases that people might have expected during those times.
I wonder though if it's because people are being checked on more during lockdown. I'm just thinking about the different check-ins that we carried out on the assessment unit, and also when I moved to C Wing, actually sort of like we're spending more time talking to the men, making sure that they've got more activities, things to do behind their doors, because obviously they weren't able to socialise. So I wonder if they felt more supported, more cared for because of that.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Whether that's the same in all prisons, I'm not sure. But it's yeah, that certainly seems to be the case. That it was, I think people found that surprising, but it was the same in the community. There wasn't the higher rates that people maybe thought there would be. But interesting, I went to visit a prison in Lithuania. It was a female prison, and yet they said that they had absolutely no self-harm in that prison. So I do wonder how much is cultural, and whether that was happening, that people just weren't reporting it to anybody, or but they were quite surprised. It wasn't like they were seeming to try and hide it. They just, well, no, I don't know what you mean. That's not an issue over here, and yet we know in the female estate prisons here, there's a high levels of self-harm, and And interestingly, you know, the within the ethnic minority groups, there is there are less numbers, so it's quite hard to generalize to them because they are so many. It is a low numbers in that group.
In Lithuania, was the level of self-harm low as well as suicide?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, they just nobody mentioned, nobody talked about it, even in a female estate.
So it's fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah, it is fascinating how that something like that would be cultural. But I know it often happened. It happened when I was at Aylesbury, and it happened when I was at Bullingdon. That when one person takes their lives, as often then somebody else will, and somebody else will. And we've seen there was a place in Sussex recently where 3 young people took their lives in the community, and there was a spate of people in Wales who were taken, you know, in a small town, and it's almost, and they don't really, people try to understand why that might be. It's almost is whether it is a way of, we don't know, people don't know why that would be, but there are spates of where people will take their own lives. My first experience of it in prison was when I was a volunteer in Aylesbury, and I had to be interviewed then by there always has to be an investigation if someone takes their own life, and because I'd interviewed him as an assessment for a programme, I'd recorded all of his answers to the questions I asked him. And so I had to be interviewed. It's quite daunting when you're not prepared for that to happen. You don't know what to expect. So it did feel quite daunting. But so they record the interview. But because I'd written all the answers down, I was confident in what I was saying. But particularly one of the questions on the interview schedule was, have you ever thought about taking your own life? And he said no. And that was only 2 weeks later. He chose to do it. So it is really hard to know, and it's hard to know whether, you know, what makes people make that decision. But that within a short period of 3 weeks, 3 people died by suicide. So and it was similar at Bullingdon. We had a spate of people taking their own lives in a short period of time, which can be really overwhelming for staff and for other residents, because I think, as you said, Emily, most people, it's their worst fear to die in prison.
I think the Samaritans refer to it, they call it the contagion effect, as in a way that some of the residents in prison might identify with the deceased, and that can increase the risk of more people taking their own lives after someone has already done it.
It's really interesting, isn't it? But again, it's hard to know. We don't know why. Yeah, this is, I think, the hard thing for us as psychologists, because we often want to know why. And like Gemma, I've had a friend who took his own life, and similar to how you said, he was really happy in the sort of the last time I saw him, which was only about a week before. And we've often seen that as well in custody, where people have almost made the decision. And I think that was the case with him. He'd had mental health problems throughout his life, and he'd just come out of a sort of a difficult spat of time for him, and I think he sort of felt, he had that feeling that I can't go through that again. So while he was well enough to do it, he did it. And it's hard for us to understand, because you think, well, you've got better now. But I think, you know, from trying to make sense of the people I've spoken to who've tried to do it or thought about it, that's been the case, that they almost don't have the energy to do it while they're depressed and very, very low mood. But when they do have the energy to do it, they see that a way of taking back control of feeling, not wanting to feel unhappy and distressed, and you know, as if everything's out of their control.
I think it's when people have decided when they're going to do it.
Yeah.
So it's a case of, like, you know, so Joe Blogs or Jane Blogs, you know, decides they're going to do it a week on Saturday. Yeah, they know when it's going to be. Yeah, and that allows them in a way to be happier up until then, because they know it's going to end. Yeah, I think when somebody has chosen to take their own life in prison, staff-wise, we'll be checking on other people. Just thinking about what you were saying there about, like, when there's more people that choose to take their own lives after. I personally don't recall there being a spate of it at Bullingdon, of when that happened. I just think it's a case of people are more alert to it, and people are more aware of it. And I wonder as well, I think over like the COVID period with lockdown, because the last 2 years have pretty much just blurred into one, haven't they? Virtually, or the last 18 months, they've gone quite quickly. I wonder for people in other establishments that have, you know, experienced people taking their own lives, whether it's actually felt more because of the, you know, the timing's actually felt quite condensed. Because I think as well, I mean, like I said, I've been very lucky in the fact that I haven't had to go to court with people, you know, when it's gone to court after someone's taken their own life, and, you know, the stress and the pain for the person who's taken their own life, family, but also for, you know, the staff at the prison.
Because every time a death happens in custody, there has to be an inquest, and so coroner's court will investigate that, and so that can be very daunting as a member of staff to have to go and give evidence at such a place and talk about what's happened. And every sort of Gemma mentioned the ACT document, so that's about assessing and caring for a person who's at risk of committing suicide or of self-harm, and so when somebody's on that document, people would write in it on a regular basis during the day. So in a coroner's court, all of those write-ups would be looked at. And so it's very daunting to think, you know, you might have written something, somebody might have written something in there, and then that would then be looked at later. So it can be very distressing. And as you said, for the family who hear all those details. And in some ways it might be, I guess, well, you'd hope that they would know that everybody had done everything they could, if that was the case, that they have been watched and constantly monitored. But we know that if people are determined to do it, they will do it. And we've seen people try with all sorts of things, even when they're being constantly monitored, they would go to great extreme lengths to do it if that's what they want to do.
I've wondered about kind of like how much support there is for prison officers having to deal with this. I think about the time when I was on the wing when somebody took their own life, and I kind of wanted to, not being involved in the sort of procedural stuff, paperwork and all that kind of practical things, but we kind of had the space to think about how we felt about it. But the prison officers had so much to do that they didn't even have the time to stop and think about how traumatizing it was. Like the first on scene, second, third on scene, everyone that was witness to what happened. And even when we think about working on a therapeutic community, it's, I guess, the relationships might be, you could argue, more intense, but you've built relationships with these men or women, and now they're no longer with us. Like that, there's going to be a level of grief involved. And I was shocked. It was my first experience. I was shocked about how much there was to do rather than space there was to feel or think.
Each prison has like, I'd imagine, well, I hope that each prison has the care team, and the care team leader will be able to set up one support for the staff that are affected directly, as well as setting up a post-traumatic debrief. Okay. And that's something like that's basically run with somebody outside of the prison service. So they come along and people are able to share what's going on. After an incident like that as well, you might have a hot debrief where everybody involved will be spoken to, generally by the governor, just so everyone can just get like off their chest exactly what they're feeling right there at that time. And then the leader of the care team should be sort of like getting in contact with staff to make sure that they are okay.
Oh, that's good to know.
Having been called in as a member of the care team during the night, that's quite an odd thing to do, but I came in and sat with an officer who was sitting with a person who'd taken their life, waiting for the police to come in. So that seems an odd thing, that he had to almost guard the person until the police came, because he would count as a crime scene until it's been investigated. But yeah, it is odd, and people I know who've been, watching, they call it a constant watch. So if somebody who's at high threat of self-harm or suicide, they will put them under constant surveillance, as it were, to try and help prevent it happening. But even then, people will be very determined to do it. And so that's very difficult for someone if they were in that position where they were watching them and they've somehow managed to do something. I remember a couple of years ago now, talking to a man who'd tried to take his own life several times, and he'd been in an open prison, being brought back into Grendon because there was a threat that he thought he was going to do it again. And he was sitting in talking to me, and it was the first time it really made me think, well, is his life to take? And he was really desperate. He felt a bit like we talked about before, that he'd been through a lot and he felt things weren't going to get any better. And we had a long conversation, and I felt he left, and I felt it was very sort of sad with him leaving, and went out, and 10 or 15 minutes later there was a general alarm on the wing and he'd collapsed, and it turned out he'd taken medication before he came in to talk to me, and so that then taken effect. So I didn't see any sign of it, but it had taken effect all the time. But it caused a great deal of distress to everybody, and luckily he didn't die. But it did, having had the conversation with him, make me think, well, if he doesn't die this time, he will be determined to keep trying, because he was so desperate. And it is really sad to think someone feels that desperate, and as a psychologist, not having something you can do to help them. But I remember talking to a psychiatrist after a man had taken his life, and just in passing about it, just happened to meet him in the corridor and was saying how sad it was. And he said, well, it is his life to take, it is their choice to do that. And if there's, we in a way shouldn't try and stop them, because it's their choice to take it. But I know I found it really hard on this occasion of talking to this man, of thinking, I've tried to sort of give him hope, which we often try to do, instill hope in people. But on the other hand, thinking, well, I'm not the one in this position that has to live feeling this desperate. So I think as forensic psychologists, we really try to help people. So it can be really difficult when we feel there's nothing we can do. How can we help a person?
Yeah, I've had a similar conversation before with someone saying it is their own life to take. And it does feel like a difficult quandary, really, because you kind of feel like, am I doing my job, or am I doing enough if I haven't helped them not take their own life? But yeah, it's just a difficult one to maneuver, really.
It is, and I guess it's our right to stop people by the same token. I mean, I worked with someone who tried to take his own life, and he'd been prevented from doing so. And so when he came to, he was furious. He was so angry, just did not know what to do with himself. He was so angry. And they'd asked me to come and talk to him. He happened to be in healthcare. And I felt like, I tried everything to sort of talk to him. And I was thinking, well, I literally don't have any more words to say. I don't know what else to say to him. But he was so, and I suppose existential, if we make that decision and we think we're going to do it, and then somebody prevents us and you're almost whipped back, it must be he was just beside himself. And when he did literally later he was pleased that he had been stopped, but at the time it was just so literally was beside himself. And so it was a really difficult position.
Personally, for me, I've done enough constant watches over my time that some people, you can sit there and you can chat to them quite happily. Others are really, really difficult to talk to. And you're just kind of like thinking he's going to do something any minute. I can think of somebody at Bullingdon and at Grendon that I've had that experience with. So I feel for staff, but I also feel for staff that are put into a position on a constant watch when they're detailed it, when actually it might not be any good for them.
Yeah. And I think we've both seen people who, will happily volunteer, or seemingly happily volunteer for those sorts of things, but actually we see the long-term impact on them when something does happen. I mean, some of the things we thought about, what the research says again about people who die by suicide, and some of the indicators might be a family history of having somebody commit suicide can be an indicator. Substance misuse, because we know that drugs can, I guess, disinhibit, or we also know, I'm sure all know of people who've taken accidental overdoses, and especially when they've just been released from prison. And people have been intoxicated, again, for the same reason. They might take more drugs or more alcohol without realizing. Having mental illness can be an indicator. And gender, although more women attempt to commit suicide or die by suicide themselves, men are 4 times more likely to actually die by suicide. So they tend to commit more self-harm. A history of trauma or abuse and prolonged stress, because the research again more recently shows that people who are on remand are more likely to take their lives, because I guess again they're unsure about what's going to be happening to them, and they could be on remand for some time not knowing what the outcome is going to be.
As we are drawing this discussion to a close, it's important to recognise that the 3 of us work in prison environments, so our discussion has been heavily weighted towards our experience of people taking their own lives in prison environments, but we are very much aware of other settings whereby suicide and people taking their own lives is prevalent, and we would welcome this conversation to carry on going. So please get in touch, write a comment, find us on social media and talk to us. And we want to hear from you. We want to hear about your experiences. We want to keep the conversation going and offer support in a shared experience where we can. So do get in touch, and what that leaves us to say is let's talk forensic psychology today.